Welcome to this course overview. This course is something I'm calling Reconstruction After Deconstruction. I'm your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. I'm also the host of the Mindshift podcast, as well as writings on the Preacher's Forum blog, which is a great resource for those of you who are deconstructing your former faith. This online course will be offered on Patreon for those who are supporters of the Mindshift podcast. Let's take a look at some of the course outcomes. What can you expect from taking this course, Reconstruction After Deconstruction? Well, first of all, I'm here to assist you along your journey of deconstruction of your former faith. That is, assuming that you have walked away from the church and quite possibly evangelicalism, Christianity itself. Now, what I'm going to talk about in this course does apply to religion in general, so it's not strictly limited to ex-evangelicals, but that's really what I want to help you do, because that's what I know. That's my background as a former evangelical. So we're going to be getting into this deconstruction element of your former faith in this course. Another aspect of this course is to assist you in reconstructing a new identity post-church, and as I mentioned before, possibly post-faith, if you've walked away from both the church and quite possibly evangelicalism, Christianity itself. And finally, I want to help connect you to a supportive and empowering community, and we're going to see how important that is in a minute. I think for a lot of us who are going through this deconstruction, who, as I say, have walked away from the church and quite possibly Christianity itself, we tend to think sometimes that deconstruction is the goal. Deconstruction is the end game. And don't get me wrong, it is hugely important. Obviously, that was, for most of us, the first step in the process of walking away from the church. Whatever your journey was, that led you to walk away, whether you were abused within Christianity itself, you had suffered too many traumas or whatever, and you walked away, or you started to deconstruct your theological beliefs, your beliefs in the Bible, whatever it was, that was a huge piece, and it still is. It's ongoing. It's never going to stop. But I think for a lot of us, we think, okay, now I'm deconstructing or I've deconstructed, what happens next? Well, that's where the reconstruction piece of this model really is important. It comes into play because our whole identity was formed when we were part of the church, and there was a whole worldview. But now we need to reconstruct. We need to find ways to form a new identity. And there's a lot of pieces and parts to what this looks like. For example, you might need to seek out some therapy. Maybe you should get plugged into a group or seek out private therapy. Maybe this is involving counseling. And notice here I say my recommendation is you find a secular, that is specifically non-Christian counselor. The reason for this is I believe that if you seek out a Christian counselor in this reconstruction piece, first of all, he or she probably isn't going to understand what you're even talking about. When you say you're deconstructing your evangelical, your Christian beliefs, you need to process these things. Okay, while they may be able to help you somewhat, the fact is they're not going to understand what you're even talking about. If they're still in the system, they probably have a biblical-based, Christian-based counseling model. They may very well try to talk you into staying in the church or coming back into the fold. So I would recommend, if you do go find private counseling, that it is a secular one who operates with secular counseling models. Another piece of this, of course, is finding a new community to replace the one that we came out of. And that's why this support piece is hugely important. Finding that community, finding that sense of support is hugely empowering in this, both the deconstruction, but also in this reconstruction piece as well. Let's think for a minute about some of the effects of religion. How were you affected by your time spent within evangelicalism, within fundamentalism? I know for me, looking back on my life, I have begun to see more and more how deeply I was affected by my time spent not only growing up in church, but being a pastor, being a student, being a minister, being a teacher of people who were going into ministry. In many ways, I was so deeply affected by religion, and now that I'm reconstructing, I'm starting to see how much damage, how much I was affected. According to a recent guest of mine that I had on Mindshift podcast, David Hayward, the Naked Pastor, he said, religion is all pervasive down to the cellular level, as it were. Every area of our life, every aspect of our lives was somehow filtered through the lens of religion. Think about it. If you were in evangelicalism, if you were in Christianity, every decision that you made had to be filtered through prayer. What is God's will? What does the Bible say? What do other people say? Relationships, where we live, what kind of jobs we had, how we spent our lives, our vocations, every aspect of our lives was filtered somehow through that lens of Christianity, religion. And the fact is, too, that many of us have experienced a wide range of traumas within religion. We're talking here sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, all kinds of tremendous traumas that we suffered, and those have affected us in many, many deep psychological, existential, in terms of sexuality, as I say, hugely affected by those traumas. And maybe we suppress them. Maybe we live with that cognitive dissonance that we suppressed and suppressed. But the fact is, it's going to come out somewhere, somehow. And we see a wide range of symptoms. Counselors report this. We're talking depression, anxiety, PTSD, and so forth as a result of these traumas and cognitive dissonance within religion. And another aspect, people really can sometimes beat themselves up. Once they've deconstructed and come out of the system, they ask themselves, how much damage did I do to others when I was part of the system? Maybe you raised children within evangelicalism, and maybe that relationship is completely broken. But the fact is, it's part of this system. We were part of the system. How much damage did you do to others? How much damage did you do to other people when you were in ministry? This is a huge burden of guilt and shame that ex-evangelicals sometimes carry around, and this is one of the effects of religion. And then finally, many ex-evangelicals, well, they'll say that leaving the church, it feels like an ugly divorce, and it's my fault. You know the story of the child whose parents get divorced, and he or she feels like I caused it. And there's trauma and pain and shame and guilt and a lot of things that go along with, leaving a relationship, something that we invested a huge amount of time, effort, money, energy into. When you walk away from that, it feels like a divorce. And a lot of times it can be a pretty ugly one. So these and more are just some of the effects of religion. And these are things that we need to reconstruct and filter through and get some help to, go on into this reconstruction piece. Now, another aspect of this is something I picked up from David Hayward, the Naked Pastor. He said basically there's kind of two paths of deconstruction. One aspect of this is, one path is deconstructing one's relationship with the church. And this is an important piece of this because, as I said before, our relationship with the church, this is where we formed our sense of identity. Who are you? What kind of person are you? It's filtered through this lens of, well, it's defined in terms of my relationship with whatever church, whatever denomination, whatever distinctives that particular denomination may have had. And this is really important. When we were part of the church, there was a huge sense of community. Significant relationships were oftentimes forged during our time within the church. There's no way around that. It's just simply the truth. That's what kept us in the church for as long as it did. We stayed because we had a lot of significant relationships with other people. We shared life for years and years and years with people. And this is not something that you take lightly when you think about walking away. But as I said before, a lot of times there's significant hurts, there's abuse, there's trauma that we may have experienced while we were part of the church. And walking away from that means we've got to go back and deal with a lot of the trauma and the hurt and the abuse that we may have suffered within the church. And so that's a huge piece, and I'm sure we could add more to it. But the other path is deconstructing one's relationship with theology and possibly the Bible as well. In terms of our theological worldview, where do we get the answers anymore? As I said before, everything was filtered through the lens of what does the Bible say? What does God say? This is our again, it goes back to our identity, but it's our worldview. Where do we go to get the answers? We don't necessarily go to pray anymore. Maybe you don't read the Bible anymore. And so where do you get your answers? How do you inform the decisions that you make when you start questioning some of these things? But there's another aspect to this. When you start questioning the Bible, there's a lot of fear, and we're going to get into this in a minute, about doctrines such as salvation, hell, heaven, and so forth. Where am I going when I die? When before, all the answers that we had were all the pat answers that we received from the church, from the Bible, from our theological system. We were sure that we had that golden ticket that was going to send us to heaven. We were going to avoid hell. And in fact, probably for most of us, if you were in evangelicalism, you spent a huge amount of time proselytizing, evangelizing to try to get other people into going to heaven and avoiding going to hell. Well, when you don't believe that necessarily anymore, or your beliefs have radically changed, what happens? And a lot of times I think on these two paths, there's kind of, it can go either way. A lot of times, if you begin by deconstructing your relationship with the church, maybe you still consider yourself a Christian, you still believe in the Bible, but you've been hurt too many times, or you cannot support the system anymore. The cognitive dissonance just becomes too much. Sometimes you're asked to leave the church, and that's obviously hugely traumatic because you don't fit in anymore. You're a troublemaker. You've asked too many questions. But it could go the other way as well. You might deconstruct your relationship with the Bible and theology while you're in the church. You're asking a lot of questions. You're not getting good answers. And again, on that basis, you might be kicked out. You might be asked to leave because you're doubting too much. And so whichever way this has gone for you, and I don't know what your story exactly is, again, there could be a lot of trauma. There's a lot of hurt and pain that's caused by walking away because of all the support system that we had when we were in the church, when we believed in this theological worldview, when we believed that the Bible was inspired, inerrant, infallible Word of God that had all the answers. Let's look at some of the negatives too, because as I've said as well, this is not all positive by any stretch. First of all, I think in a lot of ex-evangelicals, there's a lot of fear, as I mentioned before. We might be wrong about what we're doing. Am I doing the right thing? This was such a huge part of my life for so long. Maybe like me, you were raised within the church. I was in church from literally day one when I was a baby, all the way up to my late adult life. I spent over 20 years in academics, in ministry, serving the church. And so walking away from that is hugely fearful. It's very scary. Maybe I'm wrong. And another thing that ex-evangelicals will say, that there's a big fear of coming out, as it were, to friends and family who are still involved in the church. There's a fear of having that conversation for a lot of reasons. Fear that they might get rejected, fear that they're going to lose those relationships with close friends, close family who are still involved in the church. And this as well can be traumatic. And there's a social cost. Absolutely, there is a social cost that may very well have to be paid when you make the decision to walk away from the church. And it kind of goes along with both number one and number two. There's that sense of fear, not only of coming out and being afraid of what they're going to say and what they're going to do to us. Oftentimes there's a high social cost. Maybe it's economic. You might lose your job. What if you're a pastor? What if you're in ministry right now when you come out and say, I don't believe this anymore? What's the social cost that you're going to have to pay? That is a huge negative, and a lot of people won't have that coming out conversation because they're afraid and they're thinking there's too much of a social cost, so I'm not prepared to pay that. And another aspect of this is that, going along with all of these points, that friends and family who are still in the system, once you've stepped away from it, once you've walked away, we hear a lot of horror stories. They can oftentimes be very toxic, very negative, very critical, very manipulative of people who have walked away from the church and possibly Christian faith altogether. We hear horror stories, for example, of, let's say you have some children, they go to stay at grandma and grandpa's house who are still in the church. And they'll take your kids to church. They'll give them gospel tracts. They'll send them home with Bibles. They'll do all kinds of manipulative things, treat people absolutely horribly for leaving the church and leaving the faith as well. They can disown you. And so there's a lot of toxicity oftentimes that you experience from friends and family. And this is obviously a huge negative. And again, going along with all these points, there's a big sense of the loss of community, family, friends, former support networks, all the networks that we relied on. And these are not small things. You don't want to, just end your relationship with your friends. You don't want to walk away from that community. What happens if your family disowns you? It's happened in my case. I've had some family members disown me. That relationship is gone. They don't want to talk to me anymore. It's done. So that was a support network that I counted on, and it's gone. So what do you do now? These are all negatives, and I'm sure you can sure add some more to this list, maybe some things that you're experiencing that I haven't mentioned in this list. But these are all negatives, and you can see why people would be afraid to walk away from it all. And there's another element of this, anger. A lot of anger we hear about towards God, toward the church, or Christians, individual Christians, maybe pastors, leaders, just people in the church, for trauma, for abuse that we may have suffered while we were in the system. And while anger is obviously, it can be a very healthy thing, I think a lot of times that a lot of ex-evangelicals get stuck in the anger phase when they walk away and they realize how badly they've been treated, and they can turn into angry theists, for example, or just stay angry, constantly bashing the church, and that is not a healthy place to stay. This is obviously going to affect our mental health. While we need to process the anger, it's not a healthy place to stay. So there's a lot of negatives in terms of walking away, but again, these are all pieces that we're going to have to deal with in terms of reconstructing our identity and going back and dealing with a lot of this crap that we went through. The good news is, though, there are, I think, a lot more positives than there are negatives. The positives of deconstructing and reconstructing, in my point of view, are far more. They outweigh the negatives by a long shot. Let's look at some of these positives. First of all, it's an opportunity to find ways to integrate and to embrace your past experiences. This is another thing that I learned from David Hayward, the Naked Pastor. He said, you're becoming a new person. The story isn't fully written yet, but to write that new story, to become a new person, to form that new identity, you've got to integrate, you've got to embrace your past. Now, it's true, we could wall all that off, but that's not really very healthy. It's not living with fully in integrity. It's not saying, well, that's who I was, and that's the person that I was, but now what? Well, that's part of this story, is that we need to learn how to integrate, learn how to embrace, and write that into our life script and become the person that we're becoming. Another aspect of this, going along with the first point, is that deconstruction and reconstruction allows us to shape a new identity. Once we've freed ourselves from the strictures and the structures that Christianity, evangelicalism, fundamentalism placed upon us, and I think we're going to see more and more and more of that as this course goes along, it allows us this opportunity to really shape and form a completely new identity, become the person that maybe you were intended to become. Ironically, all the things that the church promised us didn't actually happen in so many of our cases, but this is your chance to come up with and shape and form a new identity. Another aspect of this is that deconstructing, reconstructing allows us to experience actually unbelievable freedom, mental health, radically changed relationships with others, possibly for the first time ever. As you walk away and you begin to free yourself from, as I say, the strictures and the structures that evangelicalism placed upon us, it's unbelievable how much mentally, much more healthy you are in terms of freedom, also physical health perhaps too. All your relationships are no longer defined in terms of you having to proselytize that other person. You can actually just have a relationship with someone else, free from all the burdens that evangelicalism put upon us. And this is an unbelievable thing And the more you experience that, the more you realize how free you actually are becoming. And that's a huge thing. That's a huge positive in my view. Another positive is that once you've walked away from the whole system, you've got the freedom now to pursue alternative beliefs, look into new life philosophies, not necessarily as a religion that's going to save you and give you that golden ticket to heaven, but really as a healthy alternative, a better, more healthy, more holistic way to live your life, whether it's in terms of physical health as well as mental health. You can get into meditation, you can look at other religions in terms of a life philosophy. You've got that freedom and without the fear of holding you back like we did before within evangelicalism. And then finally, I think another big positive is holding our beliefs loosely. What it does is it provides the freedom for us to change, the freedom to adapt as necessary for the good of our own mental health. Think about when we were in fundamentalism, when we were in evangelicalism, everything had to be nailed down. All of our theology was completely airtight and boxed in, and there was actually very little freedom to change. And if you questioned things, you were labeled a troublemaker, and you were maybe kicked out of the church or your denomination. When you walk away from that all, you're not inside the box anymore. And that is a huge thing. And if you see something that you need to change, you can go ahead and change it. You don't have these thought police, these theological thought police, almost as it were, looking at everything we think and say and checking to make sure that we're still orthodox and kicking us out of the church if we had the gall to question things. So there's a lot of positives, and hopefully you'll be seeing more of those positives as this course goes along. So let's conclude by looking at some of the benefits of this course. You can join me every month for a new installment of this course, this Reconstruction After Deconstruction. This is available for Patreon supporters of Mindshift Podcast. And here's the link to the Patreon page. And what I'm really excited about is that this is going to be an adaptive course. It's not finished yet. So as it goes along, if there are areas that you think I should cover, I can do a video on that and we can get into that. So it's very flexible. It's going to be, like I say, adaptive. So I'm really excited as to where this course is going to go. What we're going to do for sure is we're going to take a deep dive into some of these subjects, like messed up views of God. We're going to look at problems with the Bible. We're going to look at toxic theology, abuses in the church. We're going to look at some other things. We're also going to have to unpack what have the effects been on all these kind of subjects, beliefs, systems on people. And I think what we're going to find as we go through, you're going to see how exactly you've been affected. Maybe you haven't seen the connections, but I think as we go into these subjects and topics, you're going to start to see, wow, I've been hugely affected and I've got a lot of work to do in all these different areas. We're also going to get into, of course, the reconstruction piece. How do you reconstruct your identity? And you got to do it now that many, or maybe even all, in some cases, all those familiar props are gone. All those support systems, all the people and beliefs and the Bible and all that you used to rely on are gone. What do you do? So, are you ready for this journey of reconstruction and deconstruction? Please join me every month for another installation of this course, which will be available on Patreon.